Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for Sexualities and Social Issues. Today we're going to talk about how we research sex and sexuality. So we'll talk about a few of the old school theorists and the studies that they did, and we'll talk about some of the modern studies that are going on and how you can get involved. So we have a lot to cover today, so let's get started. So the first thing we're going to talk about today are research methods. So these are basically the ways in which we go about studying whatever phenomena we want to study. So once you have your question, you have to determine the best way to look into it. So in sociology, we mostly do three different kinds: qualitative, quantitative, and laboratory. So we're going to go through each one of those kinds, and I'll tell you about the kinds of studies that might help answer your question. And it's important to remember that these methods are not mutually exclusive. So any given study might use more than one of these methods. It might even use all three, but typically we just use one at a time. So let's start with qualitative research. So qualitative research is basically focused on the answers that the humans are giving, but it means that you spend a long time with the people that you're researching. So typically with qualitative research, you'll do interviews, one-on-one, you'll do focus groups where there's a leader and then a bunch of participants. You might do ethnographies, which is when you go live with the group of people that you're studying for a long time. That's usually used in anthropology, but sometimes in sociology as well. So qualitative research can be super useful because it gives us a lot of insight into the people that we're trying to study. It allows us to really ask them questions and engage in a back and forth. It allows us to analyze their language, and it allows them to tell us stuff that we might not have thought of yet. The problem with qualitative research is that it takes a really long time. You have to find the people to interview, you have to set up the interviews, you have to do the interviews, you have to transcribe the interviews, and then you have to do it all again, over and over. So qualitative research can take years and years to finish, and that is a major problem. But it does have the benefit of being able to really dig into your question and really get answers that can help us understand a problem. One example of a qualitative study regarding sexuality would be this recent paper, which is called College Students' Sexual Consent Communication and Perceptions of Sexual Standards, a Qualitative Investigation. So basically what they did for this paper was to interview college students about their sexual experiences. You can see here in the abstract that they interviewed 17 women and 13 men, and that's a pretty good sample size for a qualitative study. We typically have fewer respondents, but we spend more time with them. So basically in this study, they talked to college students about their sexual experiences, and what they found was basically that two themes emerged: the sexual double standard and the idea that men view sex as a conquest. So now they have two new pieces of information, and they can start to think about how the sexual double standard got enforced or got in place in the first place. They can start to think about why men might view sexuality as a conquest, and they can add on to the research that we've already done in those sorts of fields. So this is a pretty good example of a qualitative study because they had a research question: how's it going with the sex life on campus? They found some people to ask, they asked all of them the same questions, and then they analyzed the interviews to see what patterns emerged. So qualitative research can be super fun, but again, it can get kind of complex, and sometimes you don't even know what you're researching until you get into it. So the next kind of research we're going to talk about is quantitative research. And this is exactly what it sounds like: a lot of quantifying, which means a lot of math. Basically, in quantitative research, we're interested in numbers. We like to do a lot of statistical analysis of this kind of data, and it helps us get an idea of what's going on with a really big sample, which is very useful. So typically with quantitative research, you'll see surveys in which you invent your own questions and your own answers, or you'll see secondary data analysis, which is when you use somebody else's data that they already collected. And basically, you can either look for new information in that data, or you can use it to measure longitudinally. So you might look at a survey from 10 years ago versus a survey from today and see how different the answers are. So the important thing with quantitative data is that you want to have as much of it as possible. So you want to have as many respondents as possible, and you want to have as many answers as possible. And it can be really hard to get people to participate in quantitative data. If you've ever seen somebody standing around asking people to take a survey, you probably know that you refuse to take that survey. And this happens all the time. But basically with quantitative data, the more answers you get, the more accurate your answers are. Because the more people you ask, the better you can extrapolate to a wider population. So if you want to know what's going on with everyone in America, you need to ask at least 2,000 people. So quantitative data can be super useful for measuring a really, really big group of society, but it can also take a long time because it can be hard to get people to respond. So you have to be really careful about what your actual sample ends up being. So here is an example of some quantitative data. In this study, they were trying to figure out what kind of contraception young women were using, basically every time they had sex, from 2015 to 2017. So this is both a use of a survey in which they created the survey themselves and an analysis of secondary data in which they looked at data that had already been collected. So what they found, for instance, in this study, was that condom use was by far the most common, but a withdrawal method was practiced by more than half of the women who answered the questions. The pill was taken by about half of them, and the rest of the answers tended to be a little bit lower. So essentially what we learned from this data is that among teenage girls who are having sexual interaction in a heterosexual way, they are most likely to use condoms and second most likely to use the pull-out method. So it's really no surprise that some of them end up accidentally pregnant, because those are the worst two ways. The final kind of research we'll talk about today is laboratory research. And this one can get kind of complicated, because in addition to all of your knowledge about sociology, you might also need biological knowledge or medical knowledge. So laboratory research might be the least common, but it does also typically depend on qualitative or quantitative research to explain the answers. So sometimes with laboratory research, it's just observation. You might watch the way that people interact, you might watch what happens when people masturbate and have orgasms, and the other kind is clinical trials. So that's when you introduce a new variable and then you watch to see if it has an impact on your respondents. So laboratory research can be incredibly interesting and incredibly useful. We're learning more about the human body every single day, which is great. But it can also be incredibly expensive. So one of the reasons that laboratory research is a little bit more rare is because of the expense and because it's super invasive. If you don't want somebody to watch you masturbate, you can imagine how hard it is to get somebody to do it for a study. So you typically have a smaller number of respondents, but that data usually is used to apply to more people. So laboratory research can be incredibly helpful in terms of expanding our knowledge, but it can also be difficult to do. So here is one kind of famous example of laboratory research. They watched a woman have an orgasm while she was in an MRI machine. So you can see the different parts of her brain light up, including the amygdala and the hippocampus, and basically we know now what parts of the brain light up when a human experiences an orgasm. So again, this is incredibly useful data, and it's incredibly scientifically advanced, but it can be expensive to do, which is why it's one of the most rare. Next, we're going to talk about sociological theories. And we already talked about this a little bit, so we'll go through this part really fast. But I just wanted to remind you that basically sociological theories are not the same as in other sciences. We're not trying to prove or disprove something. It's more like a framework or a lens through which to view an issue. So typically, with a research study, a theory will be associated because it provides us with a way to think about the problem, in addition to the research methods that you're already using. So let's start with structural functionalism. And you may remember this one, but the basic argument here is that every piece of society has its own function, and each piece of society needs to work together to make the whole social structure functional. So basically, we're all playing our part, and if we each play our part, the whole thing is very smooth. So one example of this, in regard to sexuality studies, might be the recent studies on sexual harassment in the workplace. So it used to be that we understood that women were passive and men were aggressive, and that meant that at work, a woman could reasonably expect to be sexually harassed, and the man could reasonably expect to sexually harass women without facing any major penalties. However, in recent decades, especially after the Me Too movement, we started to point out that that's dumb. And women did put up with this for decades, but the thing is, they don't have to anymore. So these days you could argue that the structural function of sexual harassment in the workplace has been disrupted. And it's an interesting way of understanding the problem, because it used to flow along pretty smoothly. One person did the harassing, one person accepted the harassment, but these days we've kind of thrown a wrench in the gears, and the harassment is no longer welcome in the workplace, which is causing a lot of issues. But not bad issues. They deserve it. The next theory that we'll talk about is symbolic interactionism. So you probably remember symbolic interactionism, but the basic premise here is that everything that we do is symbolic. We are constantly trying to communicate with one another about what we want, and we are constantly giving each other signs that, if we're part of the same social world, we all understand. So one thing that you might study with symbolic interactionism would be the symbolism involved in paying for a date. Who is supposed to pay for the date, and what does it mean when they pay for the date? Typically, we expect the man to pay for the date, but that's kind of a relic of centuries past, in which men were the only ones who were allowed to work outside the house and make money. So if the man pays for the date on a first heterosexual date, what does it mean? What does it mean if the woman pays for the date? What if they're both men? What if there are no men at all? So basically, we understand this symbolically. We understand the importance, perhaps, of the man paying for the first date, but that doesn't mean that it's always relevant. So this is an interesting way to think about symbols and what can happen if those symbols get a little confusing. The next theory we'll discuss is conflict theory. So conflict theory is basically the argument that the people who have power are holding down the people who do not have power, and that essentially in society there are a series of conflicts between those in power and those without power, and that you can look at them at all sorts of different levels. So for instance, you might study the fact that trans people suffer far more in terms of assaults, or joblessness, or homelessness, or police brutality than almost any other kind of person, especially in regard to gender. So you would look at the result of a conflict between the majority population and the trans population and see how those two results can differ. Another theory that we might talk about would be exchange theory. And this is a great one when we're thinking about sexuality, because very often we do exchange sexual favors or sexual power for something else in our lives. So the argument with exchange theory is that you and the other person, or the other group of people, are exchanging something that you both find to be valuable. So lately, a lot of people are using exchange theory to talk about sugar babies. So it has become increasingly common for young people, including both men and women, to find an older partner who pays for their lifestyle. Is it prostitution, you ask? Maybe, depends on who you ask. But basically what it means is that they are exchanging, generally sexual favors, but also very often emotional labor, for money. So the rise of sugar babies is a really interesting thing to study right now, and exchange theory would be perfect for that. You might also use feminist theory, which argues that society is largely patriarchal and essentially set up for the benefit of men. An important component of feminist theory is the argument that the personal is political and the political is personal. So you might use feminist theory if you wanted to study something like the importance of virginity in young women. People are using feminist theory to study things like shirts that say you can't date my daughter, or virginal balls, or the importance of wearing a purity ring. So feminist theory can help you examine any sort of sexual issue where it looks like it's slightly different for women than it is for men. And finally, you might use queer theory. So as we discussed, queer theory can be kind of broad and hugely wide-ranging. But basically what it means is that you don't have to take anything at face value. That you can explore a lot of different ways to do the same thing, that you can sort of turn something that is traditional on its head. So queer theory might be useful for exploring the ways that people make families. And for instance, how much more difficult it is for LGBTQ families to adopt than it is for traditionally straight heterosexual families. So queer theory can be really useful for exploring social change, especially given how rapidly everything is changing these days. So again, the theories are also not exclusive. You might use more than one theory to look at the same problem, the same way that you might use more than one method to look at the same issue. So now I'm going to tell you about a few foundational researchers. Basically, people have been researching sex and sexuality for hundreds of years, and a lot of different cultures have contributed a lot of knowledge. But much like every other part of science, we mostly focus on old white guys from Western cultures because science, America. So let's start with Havelock Ellis. So he was a really interesting guy, and he was studying mostly in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but he was one of the first people to write about homosexuality in a scholarly way. So he called it inversion, and he said that basically anybody who was homosexual, or at the time transsexual as well, had an inverted sense of sexuality, that they had essentially gotten it backwards. So he didn't use the word homosexuality, he used the word inverted sexuality, but one thing that was nice about Havelock Ellis was that he didn't pass any judgments. He didn't argue that it was wrong to have this kind of sexuality. He didn't argue that it was problematic. He basically just studied people in a really scientific manner to try to figure out what was going on with them and how it might have originated and what the fallout might be. So Havelock Ellis is pretty famous for being a guy who looked at sexuality from a scientific lens instead of from a social lens. Next, we have Richard von Krafft-Ebing, and that's only part of his name. He has a really long name because he was nobility, but he was working in kind of the same time period, very much in the late 1800s. And he was actually a psychologist, or a psychotherapist actually at the time. So one of the things that he was really interested in was perversion. So he wrote the book on sexual perversion, which was called Psychopathia Sexualis. He wrote the title in Latin and large parts of the book in Latin because he was hoping it would make it more boring and that people wouldn't think it was like scandalous. So he was really interested in weird people that were having sex. Essentially, he wanted to know about the psychopathic kinds of sex, he wanted to know about the abnormal sexuality, and he started to study things like sadism and masochism. He actually invented both of those terms, which is kind of interesting. So most of his work was actually legal. His work was involved in arguing for insanity or arguing who needed to be jailed, and essentially what he was trying to do was to figure out what kind of sexual abnormalities were okay and what kind were criminal. So von Krafft-Ebing produced a lot of research, and not all of it was great, but he was useful in normalizing some of the things that typically at the time were thought of as terribly unusual. So, next, we have Sigmund Freud, my arch nemesis. Seriously though, I hate Freud, and he was wrong about everything. Freud was a psychoanalyst, the psychoanalyst, but Freud had a lot of theories about sexuality that were totally wrong. So I will give you that his theories about, sitting around talking were good. That was a good kind of therapy, but almost everything he said about sex was fundamentally incorrect and deeply harmful. Because he had a lot of students, and we still study him today, so we still talk about a lot of his ideas, even though they are largely nonsense. So he famously talked about the Oedipal complex, in which young men want to murder their father and marry their mother. Similarly, of course, the Electra complex, in which young girls want to murder their mother and marry their father. And that's not a thing. He also said that women who are immature have clitoral orgasms, and women who are mature have vaginal orgasms. And this really put women back a long way, because his argument was that you were bad if you had an orgasm from stimulating the clitoris. And this, again, was a huge problem, because not all women can orgasm from vaginal stimulation, but expecting them to as a marker of adulthood created a lot of problems. You might also know that Freud thought that women all suffered from penis envy, and that all women were obsessed all the time by their lack of a penis. Sorry to report, we do not a thing. But again, Sigmund Freud had a lot of influence, so we do still talk about a lot of his weird theories, even though they've all been proven fundamentally incorrect. And that's why I hate Freud. No. So next, we'll talk about somebody who actually did some good work. So here is Alfred Kinsey. So he was actually an entomologist. He studied wasps, but he started teaching this course on sexuality at Indiana University, and then it became huge. He was basically one of the first people to teach a course about human sexuality, and over the time when he was teaching that course, he realized that we don't have very much data. So, in the 40s and 50s, he and a whole team of researchers kind of went on the road, and they went around interviewing people all over America. And basically what they ended up doing was writing these two very famous books. So in 1948, they came out with Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, and in 1953, they came out with Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. And one of the things that he did that was really important was regarding his research methodology. So he had a whole series of codes so that nobody would know which person had said which things. And they also had a really interesting way of asking questions, which is when they would say, "When was the first time you did, etc., etc., instead of saying, "Have you ever?" It made people more comfortable to answer, because it made them assume that other people were doing the same thing, and it was just a question of when. So that was pretty clever of him. He also invented the Kinsey scale. And this is a pretty good representation of the Kinsey scale. It's a rainbow and everything. But his argument was that sexuality was not binary. People were not exclusively gay or exclusively straight, but that it was more likely that they existed in sort of a spectrum in the middle. And we have talked about this, and this is the predominant way of thinking about it these days, but he was the first person to really suggest it. So he thought that there are, of course, people who exist at a 0 or a 6, but that there were way more people in the middle than we thought. And he estimated that about 10% of the population is gay, and looking back, we think that's a little bit high, and part of that was due to an error in his research methods, which was that he did a lot of research at gay bars. And how many people in a gay bar are gay? Most of them. But how many people in a straight bar are straight? Most of them. So it does depend on where you are when you ask questions, because you might end up with data that's not exactly accurate. Next, we'll talk about Kurtfreund. So he was actually a really interesting dude who started doing laboratory science. This is when we start to see the laboratory aspect come into the sexuality research. So basically what he did was he invented a device that measures how full of blood the penis is. And it was called a penile plethysmograph, which is super interesting. But basically he invented phillometry. And why they wanted this was because a lot of people were claiming that they were gay so that they didn't have to serve in the army. And so what they would do was they would hook them up to one of these devices and then show them a bunch of pictures, and they would measure how erect the penis became when looking at different pictures. Because in that way, they could measure if people were aroused by pictures of men or by pictures of women or whatever. The most common way that people have used his methodology is to measure pedophilia. Because basically we can figure out if someone is a pedophile by measuring their arousal when they're shown different kinds of pictures. This is also how we know that very often people who are extremely homophobic are secretly gay. When they're hooked up to one of his machines and they're shown a whole series of different pictures, very often the men who list themselves as extremely homophobic have a reaction to the pictures of other men. Finally, we'll talk about Masters and Johnson. So they were a husband and wife team. Eventually they were a husband and wife team. They started as doctor and assistant, and it got messy from there. But their research also involved laboratory science. So they were especially interested in the female orgasm, because basically no one knew anything about female orgasms up until their research. And they did a lot of research on and with prostitutes, which is also interesting. So they measured, for instance, the amount of time it takes to reach orgasm, and they were the first people to find out what happens in the body when women have orgasms. They invented a special tool, which was basically kind of a clear dildo with a camera in it, and so they could watch what happened on the inside of the body when this was happening to women, and this was brand new information. So they brought a lot of scientific and laboratory and scholarly data into the study of sexuality, and again, that was a huge benefit. So they ended up writing the 1966 book, The Human Sexual Response, which was itself a bestseller. Everybody wanted it. It wasn't a very good or interesting book, but the data contained made people feel a lot better, because it indicated that other women were masturbating too, or that other men were also going to visit prostitutes. And so just knowing that other people were doing the same stuff that they were doing made people feel a lot better. So these are some of our really important foundational sexual theorists, and their research has lasting impacts on up till today. So these days, if you want to do research in sexuality, usually you have to run it through an institutional review board. And that's the board at any given university or any given think tank that decides if your study is going to hurt anybody. And that's because we had a lot of terrible studies. Basically, before we instituted rules and practices, people could kind of do whatever they wanted, and you've probably read about some terrible, inhumane research studies in the past. But I wanted to tell you about a few that are key for sexuality research. Again, these studies are incorrectly done, and we don't want you to do something like this. But sometimes by studying mistakes that other people have made in the past, we know not what to do in the future. So we'll start with the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. And this is a pretty famous study, in part because it ran for 40 years before somebody put a stop to it. So basically in this study, they were trying to determine the long-term effects of syphilis. They knew what syphilis looked like, and they knew what happened when people got it immediately, but they didn't know necessarily what happened after 10 years, or 20 years, or 30 years. So they went to Tuskegee, Alabama, and they did this research exclusively on poor black sharecroppers. So the problem with this was that they didn't really explain what they were studying. The only good thing about this study is that they didn't give anyone syphilis, but they studied people who already had syphilis, and they told them that they had bad blood. So they didn't tell them what they were studying, they didn't tell them why, they barely paid them anything at all. And the other problem is that this study went from 1932 to 1972, but we had penicillin by 1945. So they could have cured these people at any point after that, and they didn't. They just kept studying them. They didn't even tell them that a cure existed. So this was hugely problematic, because medically it was unethical, because conflict theory would do a lot to explain the fact that they were researching a very poorly educated and very poor population, and because sometimes if we can fix things, we're obligated to fix things, especially if people didn't even know that was an option. So the only reason that the study ever ended was because a newspaper journalist found out about it and published about it, and they got so embarrassed that they had to end it immediately. So this is a great example of a study that had started out with sort of reasonable means. They wanted to know what happens, but research ethics simply weren't practiced, and it ended up being really quite cruel, and all of the people involved were deeply, deeply shamed. So, next, we'll talk about John Money. So John Money was a psychiatrist who specialized in sexuality. And basically what happened was that a pair of twins were born. They were both boys, but one of them had a botched circumcision. So instead of saying, oh, we messed it up, they just decided, what if we raised this little boy as a girl? So this was in 1966. So basically, Dr. Money said that he could raise any child as a different gender if you just did it starting early enough. So they started bringing the twins, who were now being raised as a boy and a girl, in to see Dr. Money. They started doing a lot of sexual role play, which was super inappropriate. We definitely don't do that anymore. They continued to tell the little boy that he was a little girl, and basically what we found out is that you can't raise people to be another gender. As it turns out, that's not a thing. When he was, I think, 15 or 16, the boy figured out that, in fact, he was a boy and had been the whole time, and he basically changed his gender back to male. But he was so psychologically damaged that he ended up committing suicide later in life. So this is a great example of the way that we cannot force people to be something they're not. Conversion therapy doesn't work, sexual reassignment doesn't work. Basically, people have to decide if they want to change, or we have to just leave them alone. So this is a really interesting study, but a great example of the way that you can't just force some aspect of gender or sexuality on somebody. Finally, we'll talk about the study called the tea room trade. So basically this guy, Lord Humphreys, was trying to do his PhD, and he was really curious about anonymous gay sex that took place in park bathrooms. So basically he had noticed, by participating, that at certain bathrooms you would see the same cars over and over and the same men participating in the same things. So what he did was he started participating himself, and then he started writing down the license plates of the cars that he saw parked outside of these bathrooms. And then he started to really break ethics. So first, he took the license plates to a friend of his in the police department who looked up the real names and addresses of the men who had those license plates. Super unethical. Then Lord Humphreys went to their houses, and he pretended to be taking a survey, and what he found out was that a lot of the men, well, actually all of the men who were participating in this anonymous gay sex in the bathrooms were married, identified as heterosexual, and had children. So it was an interesting finding in the sense that they were doing one thing secretly and one thing openly, but it was super unethical because they didn't know they were being studied. He went to their houses. Even looking up their license plates was a huge invasion of privacy. So this guy was actually stripped of his PhD, thrown out of the program, and is no longer to identify as a doctor or a sociologist because that was so deeply unethical. So again, sometimes there's a lot to learn from studies where they're doing it wrong. So, if any of these studies have caught your attention, you might want to participate in sexuality research yourself. And there are a lot of ways to do that. We are doing new studies all the time. So one of the most common ways to participate in sexuality research is to join one of the institutes or think tanks that studies this all the time. So one of the most famous was actually founded by Kinsey, who we talked about. And these days it's called the Kinsey Institute, and it's at Indiana University. But there are also some that aren't associated with colleges. Like the Guttmacher Institute, they do a lot of really beautiful quantitative data. Or SICUS, which is the Sexuality Information and Educational Council of the United States. You might also join different societies where people present their research and do peer review on different papers. But basically, outside of academia, there are a lot of places that are doing ongoing sexuality research. However, inside academia is a great place to start. We used to not have any classes about sexuality, not like this, but especially after Kinsey, we started studying it as a valid social science, and it turned out that people want to study it. People want to know what is normal or abnormal or what the studies are showing or disproving. So most sociology programs have a class in sexuality now, and you can always further your education with a master's or a doctorate in sexuality, or you can stay focused in sociology but get a doctorate with a focus in sexuality. So basically, this can be a great way to go, because if you end up staying in academia, you can get a lot of your research funded that way, and there's an endless supply of undergraduates to study. You might also want to write a book. These days, these sort of pop science books are all the rage. And this is kind of great, because most of these people are academic researchers, but writing your books in a different style, like in a more accessible style, has been a huge thing in terms of sexuality research. Because again, people want to know. It's just that they're afraid that they won't understand the studies, or they don't have access to the journals. So if you write a book like one of these, Sex at Dawn studies the way that humans have been, thinking about sexuality in terms of culture over the course of history. It's great. The Ethical Slut, a book about how to be slutty, but doing so ethically. Dude, You're a Fag was a huge book because it was about the way that sexuality is dealt with in middle school, and essentially about the way that people were accused of being gay even though the kids didn't know what gay was, and the way that the word fag got used as an insult that had nothing to do with sexuality. So there are all sorts of things that you can study and then produce sort of pop culture books about, which is a great way to reach a wider audience. You might also join in government-funded research. Very often there are different government programs that are mostly focused on sexual health. There's a lot of AIDS research and condom use research, but giant organizations like the CDC do very often hire people who are behavioral scientists or people who have a more STEM sort of focus but are still studying issues in sexuality. So you might end up studying things like epidemiology, you might study things like sex education, but basically that research would be promoted and funded by a government institute. So that can be a really good way to go because they have a huge reach. Some examples of studies that have a really big reach. First, there's the General Social Survey. So this is a huge study that goes out all around America, and they do it every year since 1972. So this is really useful for quantitative analysis, because this is what I was talking about when I talked about secondary data analysis. They ask a lot of the same questions from year to year. So you're able to gauge how the answers change from year to year, which is very useful for thinking about how Americans decide what's good and what's bad and what's acceptable and what's not. So this study is carried out by a program that is affiliated with an institution at the University of Chicago. But basically, it's a really important study because even though it's not solely about sexuality, there are a few questions about sexuality, and that data goes back decades, which is great. You might also look at the National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior, which is based in sexuality, but this one doesn't have quite as many runs. They've been doing it roughly every 2 years since 2009, but it's also in part funded by a college. This is part of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University, and they look at thousands of people every time they do this study. So again, sometimes they ask the same questions, which can be useful for secondary data analysis, and sometimes they invent brand new questions, which can be useful for studying new phenomena. So basically, there are some great big studies that can give us super interesting data. Here's one example. This graph is from the National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior that we just talked about, and I thought you might think this was interesting because they're basically measuring whether people identify as gay or lesbian or bisexual based on both their gender and their age. And one of the things that you'll notice in this study is that men are more likely to identify as gay than they are to identify as bi, but women are much more likely to identify as bi than they are to identify as gay. You'll notice, for instance, that among females 14 to 17, a pretty substantial number of them identify as bisexual, but it's lower by the time they get to 18 or 24. So this is an interesting example of something that we can study using the data from these giant surveys. One major field of study in regard to sexuality is HIV and AIDS. So the truth is that this is a big social problem, and it is a big medical problem, but that means they get a lot of funding. So very often, people who are studying something in regard to HIV or AIDS will kind of sneak in an extra question about sexuality that other sexuality researchers can use to expand their data. So very often, when you're seeing a survey about something like HIV or AIDS transmission, you might see a sort of extra question about something like condom usage, or sexual preference, or relationships to the families. And that's the kind of data that people can use to expand our knowledge, even though technically we are also studying HIV and AIDS. Which brings me to my final point, which is that most sexuality research is underfunded. It's kind of an unpopular area of research, even though everybody is interested in sex, because it can be hard to get this research approved because people are worried about the trauma that you might cause to your respondents, or they're worried about the reputation of the university if you seem to be studying sex a lot. It can also be really hard to get people to participate. Sometimes people think that it might be too scary or too personal. So it's hard to get funding for sex research, but there are a lot of things that we know we need to study. For instance, we have very little data on women's sexuality even after all this time. We also know that there is a relationship between social inequality and sexuality, but we haven't been able to study everything about that. We also know that there's a huge relationship between social media and sexuality, especially in terms of how early you get involved in posting pictures of yourself or sending videos back and forth, or the ways that people are making money from social media in regard to sexuality these days. So basically, even though it's a great big field of research, we still have a lot of problems with getting funding and getting studies approved. So if any of this caught your interest, you can always help by joining us. You can begin studying sexuality, you can fund sexuality research, you can take part in studies that you see advertised. All of that helps us to gain more knowledge, and that always is a good thing. So, if you have any questions, as always, please send me an email, and I'll see you next time.